Hi, and welcome to the Unity Editor Basics series. And we're going to be talking about the component option up here in the menu bar. So before we start talking about what a component is, let's talk generally about game objects. So a game object is a collection of components such as transform, rigid body, etc. So for example, let me add a 3D cube object in my scene, and if I select the 3D cube object in the inspector window to the right, you can see that it has all these components. So it has a transform component, mesh filter, mesh renderer, and a box collider component. So game objects and components go hand in hand. Game objects are the building blocks of a game scene, and anything that is part of a game scene is a game object. So for example, in an empty game scene where you haven't as yet added anything, you have the main camera and the directional light game objects. Right? And then we can add other game objects to a game scene, for example, a player, enemy, cube, bird, cow, etc. And all of these are game objects. So how is a game object such as this 3D cube defined? Now, a game object is a container object for components with some common properties and functionalities. And you can add components to a game object, and similarly, you can also delete components from game objects. And game objects in your game scene will have some common properties and components. And let's discuss some of these common properties that your game objects will have. For example, main camera, directional light, and this cube object. So let's discuss some of these common properties. Out here we have this active checkbox, right? And it allows you to set the active state of a game object. So right now it's checkmarked. If I uncheck it, you can no longer see the cube object in the scene. So it's been deactivated. If I add the check mark, it's now active in the scene and you can see it. We have this name text box here, which allows you to set the name of the game object, which for us is just cube. And we also have this tag drop down, which will allow you to set the tag of a game object. So you can have a bunch of game objects which have the same tag. And this static option here, right, will allow you to set a game object as a static in a scene. And static, anything that is marked as static basically means it's not going to be moving in the scene. And then we have this layer drop down menu, which allows you to set the layer in which the game object will be placed. So we have the default layer, ignore raycast, water layer, UI, etc. Right? You can also add your own layer. Now, one thing to notice is that the transform component is present in all game objects. So it's here in the cube, floor, directional light, and even my main camera game object. Now, if I make a empty game object like so this is my empty game object, you see that even my empty game object has the transform component. Right. So let's talk about components now that we've talked about some common properties of game objects. So what is a component? A component defines a game object and its functionalities. For example, the transform component out here to the right, it defines the position, scale, and rotation of a game object in the X, Y, and Z axes, right? And we can add and remove game objects from here by checking this clicking on this box, the three dots to the right. So you can add, you can remove a game component, but remember that you cannot remove the transform component. So if I try to remove the transform, I actually cannot do that. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the components of the cube game object, right? So you see it has the mesh filter, mesh renderer, and box collider component. And the mesh filter component will define the form or geometry of a game object. For example, the cube or the mesh filter for the cube tells Unity that the shape of the game object is a cube, and the mesh render component will render the geometry or the mesh based on the mesh filter. So the mesh renderer tells Unity how to display the object. Excuse me. And then we have the box collider component, which defines the geometry for physics collisions. So this is going to be a box collider. And basically the collider is used for 3D physics. Unity will keep objects with colliders on them so that the objects don't pass through each other, right? So that you can collide into game objects. Now the directional light game object has the transform component. It also has a light component. And the main camera has the transform component. It has a camera component and an audio listener component. So you can build your own game object by using the empty game object and basically then adding components on. So for example, I can add the light component to this empty game object. And let's go ahead and talk about all these options here in the component drop-down menu. So we've discussed the mesh renderer and mesh filter when we discussed the cube objects, and we have these other mesh options too. For example, text mesh and text mesh pro for adding text to UI interfaces. Text mesh pro is a replacement for Unity's older text mesh, and it's much better because it's basically responsive to screen size. And we also have a skinned mesh renderer, which is for rendering bone animations on humanoid characters. And then we have the effects option, and we can add components like the particle system, halo, and a projector, so on, to a game object. So for example, let me select the cube game object, and let me go ahead and add the particle system effect, right? So I'll delete this, remove component, and then I can also, I can now add, let's say, the halo, right? So the halo effect. Now, we have other effects, and we can discuss them later on as we use them. Okay, so coming down, we have physics, and the physics component lets us emulate many physics type interactions in our game by adding these colliders onto our objects. So we can, we can give gravity to our game and so on and so forth. And just know for now that these are components provided by Unity, which you can add to game objects. Right. So let's talk about the navigation component down here. Now, we also have physics 2D. So if you're building a 2D game, you have a box collider 2D and circle collider 2D, so on. Right. So coming down to navigation. Now, the navigation component is for adding things that will allow the character to navigate the scene. So for example, you can use nav mesh agent to allow a NPC, which is a non-player character, to patrol the scene. Off mesh link component allows you to incorporate in navigation shortcuts which cannot be represented using a walkable surface. So for example, jumping over a ditch or a fence or opening a door before walking through. Now lastly, the nav mesh obstacle component allows you to describe moving obstacles that nav mesh agents should avoid while navigating the game world. For example, barrels or crates, which are, controlled by the physics system. So we also have the audio and video components, right? So we can add audio. So for example, we can add an audio source to this GameCube by adding the audio source component, and then we can select an audio clip for this game object, the cube game object. And this lets us do things, for example, adding a fire crackling sound to a fireplace game object, right? So we also have video component, so we can add a video player to a game object. And then we have the rendering option, which has all these components associated with it: camera, skybox, and so on. Right? So if I add the camera component to my game object, what this is going to do is that it's going to add the camera to the GameCube, and we see the game world now through the perspective of the GameCube. So if I move it back and forth, you're seeing the game world through the perspective of the GameCube. So let me go ahead and just delete the camera component. So remove component, right? And we also have other options, rendering options, such as skybox. Now, a skybox is a 6-sided cube that is drawn behind in the scene of the game, representing the sky, right? And we add it to the main camera rather than a particular game object in our scene. So out here, this is the sky that you're seeing is basically that 6-sided cube, which is called a skybox. Right. So we have a whole bunch of other rendering options, which we won't cover in this tutorial as they are per use case basis, and we'll cover these in detail in separate tutorials. So for example, we can add this light component to the game object, the cube, right? And let me just remove the halo on my game object, and I can also deactivate it by just turning off that check mark. And here you see I have a point light associated with my cube game object. Let me change the color to green and change its intensity to 9. And here you can see it added this light to my game object, this point light. And now my cube could be, for example, it could be a light bulb, right? Okay, so coming down here, we have tile map, which is used in Unity 2D to make 2D game levels. And we have a whole bunch of other components that we can add to a game object. For example, layout, playables, miscellaneous, which has all these options, scripts, because as you know, scripts are components that are attached to game objects. And we have UI, which has all these options. For example, you could add, a menu to your game scene using TextMesh Pro. And then we have events, which have all these components, right? So now we've talked about adding components from here. What you also need to know is that you can also add a component to a game object. So for example, let me remove this light component from my 3D cube. We can also add a component from the inspector window by clicking on this add component button and then searching for light. So let me just type in light again, and here we can see it gives us this choice, light component, and then basically you can add your light component from the inspector window using the add component option. And that's all for this video. If you thought this was useful, go ahead and click subscribe.